I'm joined by a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Brian O'Toole, who is also a key figure in implementing US government commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. Mr. O'Toole, a pleasure to have you with us. Looking at the context inside of Iran, could this move play into the hands of hardliners in the country?
Thanks, and appreciate you having me. I think it's a good question. It's hard to say in some respects whether it's going to play more into the hardliners' hands than the JCPOA itself. I think the Trump administration itself would argue that the JCPOA played into hardliners' hands by giving them, a little bit more freedom and more money to cause havoc in the Middle East. I'm not sure that I buy the direct linkage quite as much. But I do think there's a concern now that pulling out of the deal just strengthens those hardliners even more and would give them the opportunity to cause even more havoc and potentially target U.S. interests in the region. Sure,
but does this mean, at least for Iran's leadership, though, as, of course, dissatisfaction grows, that we could perhaps see a military takeover in the country?
I don't know about military takeover. I think the general understanding is that the Supreme Leader is still relatively firmly in charge. I think the more likely scenario that you would see, though, is that President Rouhani, who ran on a platform of getting sanctions lifted, is going to find himself increasingly marginalized. People in the country were already angry about the pace of sanctions relief and how little economic, gain that they saw themselves. And so I think that will embolden those in the IRGC and who might be more hardline to make more of a push for the power that Rouhani currently holds.
If the deal ultimately falls over and Iran does go back to enriching uranium, does this not effectively guarantee a military confrontation of some sort?
I'm not sure it guarantees a military confrontation. I think a lot of people thought the same thing was going to happen with North Korea, and that didn't. I do think if Iran goes back to enriching uranium and pursues a nuclear weapon, it'll probably be doing itself a disservice and helping the Trump administration more than it wants to, because that's going to turn the Europeans against Iran. I mean, right now, Iran is in a relatively strong position, given that the U.S. backed out of this deal unilaterally with no evidence that Iran was violating it. If Iran turns to violating the kind of structure of the deal, or at least the parameters of it, even if the deal isn't in place, they lose that moral high ground that the U.S. ceded yesterday.
Right, but the economic impact is expected to be worse than dire for Iran. So then what options really are there for the country other than holding direct talks with Trump?
It's a very good question. I think, they're in a position where their economy may be a little bit better than, the kind of 2007, 2008 up to 2012 ramp up of sanctions. And so they might be able to hold on for a little while. The currency crisis, I think, is the thing that they have to worry the most about domestically. But I think they may have some time in between kind of now and economic collapse down the line where they can try to leverage that hand and that moral high ground they have to separate the U.S. and drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe, which is the key. I mean, they're going to have China, Russia, Turkey, probably India reacting very badly to this and being reluctant to go along with U.S. secondary sanctions, which are powerful, but require some degree of cooperation to have the coercive effect that the U.S. really wants to have.
And to that point, U.S. National Secretary Advisor John Bolton, he's been reported as saying that European companies doing business in Iran will have to stop doing so within 6 months or they'll face those secondary U.S. sanctions. Do these countries have a real choice as to whether to toe the line?
I think European countries are in a much harder place than countries that are a little bit farther removed from the United States. National Security Advisor Bolton noted the two wind down periods, right? There's a 90-day deadline for certain sanctions, and then it's 180 days, those 6 months for particularly the oil and banking sanctions, which are kind of the most harsh in the toolkit. And so European businesses are going to want to get out as quickly as possible because it's going to be very difficult for them to do business in Iran and still maintain access to Western markets, given how integrated they are with the United States economy.
Right. Brian O'Toole, appreciate that insight there.